Hello guys, and welcome back to Connor Reads. Today we're going through a political book. I have it right here, and it's called The Great Experiment: Why Diverse Democracies Fall Apart and How They Can Endure. And it's by someone called Yascha Mounk. And I did a little bit of research. Yascha works at Johns Hopkins University as an associate professor. And he is also, I believe he's German and American as well. So he definitely knows his stuff. Before we jump in there, I do want to throw a disclaimer out. I am definitely not a political expert or political commentator. I'm just a man who likes to learn. So if you would like to learn more about this book and this topic with much better examples, more eloquent explanations, and an opportunity for you to form your own ideas, the best thing to do would be to buy this book and run through it. So without any further ado, let's hop into it. So the first thing I wanted to dive into was I wanted to explain to you guys why I chose this book. Now, I've been doing a few different books more focused on politics. One of them was 1984, one is Animal Farm, and one is How Fascism Works. And they highlight how simple it is to get people to hate each other, how to create a large, controlling, authoritarian group that really makes a very miserable time for the rest of people inside of that country. So the more I read these, the more I thought, well, surely you can have big, diverse democracies and them work. But the issue is if we look back in time at history, the actual answer so far has been no. So when I saw this book on the shelf, I was super excited to hear this person's and professor's opinion, Yascha Mounk, on how this is going to be done. And so let me summarize it for you and take you on this journey. I think the first thing that Professor Mounk does, which is super important, is he sets the scene. Why is it so difficult for diverse democracies to exist and to prosper? And it's actually quite simple. So for there to be a democracy, it means that every person in that democracy needs to be able to have a voice and to be represented, so they get one vote. So naturally, what happens is, as people who come into your nation or your culture or your voting democracy environment that don't look like you, don't sound like you, have different customs and different languages and maybe different wants and needs, it is very natural for there to be apprehension, worry, and even a lot of intolerance from those groups. And that's where the basis issue lies for diverse democracies. Because, of course, if those people vote for what they want and they become a majority, then maybe now my interests won't be looked after. So it's best for me and my group to create a system that doesn't allow this and really keeps things unilateral, with one culture, one skin color, one race, one language, essentially. But the issue is, well, we would like diverse democracies. We're moving into a more tolerant world. How is this possible? And Professor Mounk goes even further to explain that humans love to form groups. We'll form them over anything. But there are four main ones. You have class, you have race, you have religion, and you have nationality. Now, these are the four main groups that humans find it really easy to stick to. And historically, humans needed these groups. If we create groups, what it does is it stops issues, crime, violence, and oppression inside of the groups. However, it definitely encourages crime, violence, and war between groups, which is an issue when you're trying to create a diverse democracy. But just as an example, just because those four characteristics are the easiest things to make groups of, doesn't mean that they supersede everything else. You can have small things that people feel passionate about that do supersede those four issues. For example, if you were a different class to me, a different race to me, a different religion to me, and also a different nationality to me, but we both supported the same soccer team, the greatest soccer team in the world, Manchester United, then oftentimes we can find commonality where those four things don't matter anymore, which just goes to show how arbitrary some of these groups can be, but it doesn't belittle how important it is to those humans of that group and why it causes so many problems. Professor Mounk then goes on to talk about the three different reasons why democracy breaks down when there is lots of diverse groups inside of one nation or one area. And the first answer is anarchy. Now, anarchy is a word I've heard growing up a lot without ever really knowing exactly what it means. So if a large country or even a small country has lots and lots and lots of small different divides, so different cultures and different groups, and what happens is the government decides to allow them to govern themselves and they don't create a strong central state, then what is natural is for there to be lots of war, lots of violence, lots of oppression, but we're just lacking a large majority and a strong state. So what that means is it's kind of an everybody versus everybody mentality, which creates absolute chaos, and that is no longer considered a democracy. So anarchy occurs when the state doesn't take control and isn't strong on its policies and really allows everyone to police themselves. The second way that democracy will break down in extremely diverse countries is there will be one majority and then a lot of immigrants, and something called domination will occur. This is essentially the rise of fascism or ultranationalism, and one race or one religion or one culture or one nationality will completely dominate the other nationalities that come in. The most extreme version of this was, of course, the immigration of slaves to the US and the dealing of African Americans afterwards by the US population, which was, of course, slavery. And the final way democracy breaks down is something called fragmentation. This is when you have several different large groups inside of one area or one country. And a good example of this is Lebanon. So Lebanon had Sunnis, they had Shias, and they had Christians. Three very strong religions, all with large groups in the country. Now, what they decided to do was allow each different religion to govern their own people. They didn't have large and wide and power deciding elections inside of that country because they didn't want to create a struggle between these religions. So the elections didn't really count for much. This is kind of counterproductive when it comes to democracy, because all of a sudden you have people in positions that are responsible for large numbers of people and have huge amounts of power who are not elected anymore. And this is really a farce, no longer leading to democracy, and that's fragmentation. So inside of the book, Professor Mounk goes into a lot more detail with much better examples, but those are the bare bones of why we've been unable to successfully have diverse democracies up to this point. The next thing that he points out and outlines is, well, what is needed for a diverse democracy to continue and to be successful? And he highlights two different things. The first thing he highlights is that citizens, especially anybody in a minority, need to be completely free of state oppression, meaning that they can't be oppressed by the majority and they can't be oppressed by the government in place as well. And this is step one of having free, diverse democracies. What that first step allows is for these individuals to be true to their own identities. And I thought that was a pretty straightforward step. It's something that I think anybody could have highlighted if you had asked them, even, somebody as young as a 10-year-old, people should be free and they shouldn't be oppressed by the state or by the majority, because that's what we think of when we think of oppression. We think of the majority in an area oppressing a smaller amount of people. Again, an extreme example would be the Nazis oppressing the Jews all across Europe. However, there is a second point that he comes up with, which I thought was really, really interesting. His second point is that people should be able to escape the tight embrace and something called the cage of norms, which is the normal behavior and the normal activities expected from people born into certain cultures, certain religions, and certain areas, or even just families that are extremely controlling. So not only should people have freedom from the state and the majority, they should also have freedom from the culture or minority that they are born into as well. And I thought that was super interesting. But how do we go about doing this? So let's talk about the first point. So the first point essentially is we don't want anybody able to oppress large amounts of people or minorities. So there are three things in place in most countries that ensure that this cannot happen. And their effectiveness really depends on how legitimate these three practices are. The first one is regular elections. Now, previously we've had kings, emperors, monarchs, we've had dictators from all over the world in different time, places, and different locations. The issue with a dictator or somebody who is set to rule for life is, number one, they might be terrible at their job, and number two, regardless of if they are or if they aren't, you kind of have to wait for them to die, and singularly, your singular hope, is praying that the next person in line, who you probably can't choose, it's probably going to be their son, realistically, is a little bit better. So with regular elections and term limits, it means that we do get a change of leadership. We get to decide who the leaders are, and they can't outright lie about everything they're going to do to get into office, because there will be another opportunity for the public to give their opinion via vote. The second thing that a lot of countries do is the separations of power. Now, there's nothing to stop these people, once they are elected, to changing all of the rules and making sure there is never another election and setting themselves up as a dictator. So what countries will do is they will split the three or maybe four, arguably, powers. You have the executive, which is the government itself making the decisions and signing the orders. Then you have the legislature, who is responsible for signing and creating law and legislation, and those two are separated. Then you have your judiciary, who is responsible for upholding the law and making big decisions on what is constitutional or what abides by the law and what doesn't. And then the final one, you could argue, is the press. So you need all four of these to be separate and to be able to have checks and balances on each other to ensure that not one section of the government or of the overall power can create a large amount of oppression from nobody checking up on what they're doing. The final thing that we need from our government is individual rights. So this, for example, would be like the Bill of Rights, something that says what the government can decide for us and what we have a right to decide for ourselves, like the right to liberty, the right to education, the right to work, the right to freedom of speech, the right to our own opinion, and those types of things. They need to be clearly marked so we understand our freedoms. And those three should be enough, if they're executed correctly, to ensure that we do not have oppression from a government and we do not have oppression from a majority on a minority. But what about making sure that there's no coercion from inside of our own minorities for those people that are a part of that population? If we're going to have a lot of diversity, there's probably going to be a lot of smaller minority populations. We need to ensure that they are not coercing or oppressing the people inside of their own sectors. And Professor Mounk argues that the most important thing for this is philosophical freedom. We need to ensure that everybody is able to choose, if they want to be educated on different religions, educated on different cultures, different ways of living life, and having the freedom to go and move into those and explore those if they want to. So really what we need as a unit and as a country or nation that's trying to be diverse, Professor Mounk argues, is we need some overarching theme that we can all believe in. Patriotism. Now, patriotism can be quite a scary word, but it's not to be mixed up with nationalism. Now, I didn't really know the difference between the two, but nationalism, we will say, is used in fascist rule and ultra-nationalists, hence the name. Patriotism, Professor Mounk argues, is something a little bit different. It's more of excitement about certain ideals. Now, what can we do to ensure that patriotism isn't a negative and is something that can really bring our big, diverse community together rather than cause separation, which sometimes it has previously? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is ensure that patriotism is civic patriotism. What that means is it's not based on, well, who was already here, where your ancestors are from, etc. It's actually based on the founding beliefs of a country. So, for example, the Constitution in the US. Now, we know that during that period of time, there was a lot of things going on in the US that are definitely unacceptable by today's standards and in fact are quite horrific. However, the Constitution laid out and the amendments put in place are something that immigrants and people who live here alike can get excited about. So if we believe that patriotism is about the Constitution and is about the ideals put forth rather than the color of someone's skin, how long they lived here and how far back their ancestry goes, that is a great form of patriotism that we can all get behind. And that brings us to Professor Monk's second point about patriotism, is it allows it to be accessible for all. Patriotism needs to be something that somebody on their first day legally entering this country can be included in, as well as somebody who can trace their lineage all the way back to the very first memories of a certain country or the founding individuals of that country as well. They need to have equal access to that patriotism and to not be thought less of for being brand new to the country. And civic patriotism can do that. And the third thing we need to do is create love for the culture of a nation. We need to ensure that people are excited to influence each other's cultures. They are also excited to learn about other people's cultures. And overall, we just need to create an idea that this is ours. This is our ideals, and they are fantastic. However, a lot of places have similar constitutions. So, and if you go, I'm from Europe, if you look in Europe, and an example that Professor Mounk uses, it should really feel like home, right? The area where you're living. And that's what creates patriotism. However, if you look at some of the homes in France, you can travel 400 or 500 miles across borders, and they will actually look similar to a lot of homes in Belgium or towns in Germany. And if they have the same ideals and they look similar, what's stopping patriotism just be something that's worldwide? Why would, if I'm French, why would I not feel patriotism for Germany and vice versa? Well, the idea is that there's going to be some things that are unique to your area. And although a lot of families, for example, have the same ideals, yours is your own. So it's about getting excited about the culture that we have for this home and this area, and including as many people as possible. And that's one way we can help with the diversity. Well, how do we create this? Professor Mounk first says that what needs to happen is we need to create deeper empathy and more excitement to stand up for the basic rights that you believe in. If we can get patriotic about the Constitution or the ideals that a country has, and we can include people in that, then the next step is making sure that we don't care what someone looks like or where they're from. If they're included in this patriotism that we've created, then we are excited to stand up and ensure they receive the same rights as anybody else in this area, because those are our ideals. The next is virtue of mutual influence, being excited to learn about people's cultures and really how much we can influence each other, rather than just being so scared about things changing or too scared about appropriating someone else's culture. We should really be excited about what we're able to do and how we're able to influence people. And finally, what we can do as people is bigger emphasis on what we share. Each group can't be scared of losing what they have. Not because their nationality, their culture, their religion, and their practices aren't important. They are. But if we're going to have a diverse democracy that is successful and has done something that other democracies haven't previously, we need to ensure that those aren't the only defining factors. Otherwise, we're just going to go back to the problems we had before. You are more than just your race, your religion, and your culture, regardless of what it is. Now, a big problem, of course, is that people are very negative about this idea. You have those people who don't want it to happen in any way, shape, or form, and they're pretty negative about it anyway. But also you have people who are extremely behind diverse democracies, and to try and get a shock factor or to try and illustrate the issue, they're often very negative about what we've achieved so far. But Professor Mounk actually says there's so much that has been achieved and so many reasons for optimism. So let's talk about a couple of them. Well, one big positive is that only 50 years ago, most people would say that you needed grandparents from that country to be considered to be from that country. However, today it's much more focused on, well, can they learn the culture? Can they learn the language? And finally, being born here isn't a prerequisite of being from that country. And that is a huge step in the right direction. And to build on top of that, although language definitely can be a problem, luckily I moved from the UK to the US, so it wasn't. But I can imagine if I'd come from somewhere such as maybe Mexico, which is a common immigration, it could be really, really tough to learn the language quickly. However, by the third generation, it is proven that 95% of immigrants who are on their third generation know the language, the new language of the area they've moved to fluently, and actually a lot of them have forgotten how to speak the previous language. Not that that is a positive, but just part of the statistic that was put in there. It's also been proven that 2/3 of immigrants actually have a deeper respect and a deeper trust for the institutions of the country they've moved to than those people who were there in the first place and had grown up there. That's interesting. Another argument that often holds people back is the difference between in jobs and education between those people born in the country and those immigrants that have moved in. And there is no denying that in certain areas there are big gaps. However, there are some examples where immigrants have actually surpassed, on average, those who are naturalized from that country. In the United Kingdom, Indians on average earn a lot more money and have more wealth than the average white British family. And the same statistic is true in the US of Chinese, Lebanese, and Nigerian families. But it is true, certain races and certain cultures do struggle when they first move into countries to get more skilled jobs. However, by the second and third generation, they are all caught up. And even one of the groups of people, Black Americans, who suffered through one of the hardest dominations ever to occur and really set their starting line infinitely far back, they now have some very positive statistics coming through as well. Are they caught up? Absolutely not. However, Black women in the US now have a higher propensity for upward mobility than white women in the US. I mean, that's a pretty optimistic statistic. Now it's much harder to figure out how somebody is going to be voting just based on their race, whereas beforehand it was pretty simple to look at somebody's skin color or language they spoke and predict how they're going to vote. That's a positive outlook and shows that we are becoming more diverse as a community. And finally, another optimistic statistic is that in today's society, especially in the US, there is much less prejudice of people of different races procreating and having children. In today's world, it's happening very, very regularly. In fact, in America, 1 in 7 children born have parents of 2 different races, which I suppose is really the definition of diversity taking hold in a country. And with all these positive stats and optimistic ideas, I think Professor Mounk's overall idea is that, well, if we continue to look at things very, very negatively and we don't appreciate what has been able to happen so far, 2 things are going to happen. Number one, those people who have no interest in creating a diverse democracy and very negative towards it, if they hear that things aren't getting any better and they haven't improved at all, then they're going to say, well, why are we even bothering? Let's undo what we've tried to do so far. And those people who do want things to get better are thinking, well, we're putting so much effort in and nothing's changing. Why should we continue? So a little bit of optimism goes a long way. And finally, Professor Mounk talks about, well, what are some policies we can put in place to ensure that this continues to get better? What can governments do? Well, step 1 is economic growth. Countries where the economy is growing creates more opportunities and just has happier people. And if your economy is growing, your people are happy and there's a lot of opportunities, people are overall more positive about immigration and diversity. We need to continue or improve universal solidarity on funding schools that are underfunded in inner cities, ensuring that there aren't just a ton of unpaid internships that really are only opportunities for people whose family already have a lot of money. They aren't the only gateway into high level and high success roles. And for colleges to continue to do some positive discrimination until the playing field is level. And the final point that Professor Mounk gives out is that we need real control over immigration. If we have proper control over the borders, who comes in, who doesn't come in, and it is systematic and effective, then it gives people trust in the immigration process. So in this book, he has a million great descriptions, theories, examples, laws, and I would never be able to cover all of them. So if you want to know more, then read the book. If you completely disagree with what I've said, please read the book, because I'm just somebody who is reading it and relaying some of the message to you. But I think his overall message is mutual respect. What's important is that people don't go out there and try to make enemies. We're not looking at somebody and trying to and think, hey, I don't like that person, I'm going to adopt the opposite of what they like, which I think is quite common in today's society. What's more important is that people stick to their own principles. What principles do you believe in? It's okay if someone you don't particularly like overlaps with your principles. It's not black and it's not white. It's a mix in between. People aren't wholly good and they're not wholly bad. It's important to ensure that we know that there is a line in between. The second thing with mutual respect is to ensure that you're okay with criticizing your own side and even your own opinions. New information is important and it will force people to change their mind. If you're somebody who never changes their mind, can never take an inch of criticism for anything that your party or your area or culture or race or location does, you're probably someone who's not very reasonable to deal with. And the final thing is, of course, we're all entitled to our own opinion. But when we are having discussions, it is important not to vilify or ridicule people. Just try to persuade and engage. Let's create these diverse democracies. Okay, and that's my overall summary. It's a lot longer than it normally is, but there's so much information to digest. I'm going to move into 3 things I loved and a couple of things I didn't like. Starting with something that I did love. I loved the examples, the depth of the examples. He used examples from all over the world, and he also used positive and negative examples from almost every single country, which I think is really, really important to show that this person, obviously they have some kind of agenda. His agenda is creating diverse democracies that don't fall apart and endure. But I don't think he did it in a way that was scapegoating any kind of countries or any type of systems previously. It was more just focused on giving information for the reader to digest, which I thought was great. One thing I didn't like was I'm not deep in the politics game. I don't understand everything inside and out. And it's a theory, this book. Like, it's a theory because we are starting to have some diverse democracies, of course, but really he's trying to describe something that can come to pass in the future. And it was just very wordy. Like, there were sections of the book that were really hard for me to read, especially towards the middle. There was a lot of theory, a lot of examples, a lot of political language used, and I just found it difficult to plow through certain sections. Another thing that I really liked is he's definitely a humble author. He talked a lot about how this book isn't going to be like an instant fix. He talked about how a lot of books will try and give huge policy changes that need to happen that realistically aren't going to happen. So I enjoyed reading his stuff, and I think that he was quite relatable as a person and quite realistic as to like the goal of this book. His goal of this book isn't to change your mind completely. I think it's really just to give you information for you to start plowing forwards with. Second thing I didn't like that much was there was so much political language in there. I feel like this is kind of like a catch-22 because of course there's going to be political language in there. It's a political book, but I just don't know all the words. So I had to spend a long time Googling words and trying to figure out exactly what they meant, and then, you know, having to read sentences with them in there over and over again. It's not a big negative, but for me it was like it slowed me down a bit. However, I did learn some new words. What did I learn? I learned what sanguine or sanguine means, and it means this. The final thing I liked is it did give me a lot of hope. After reading like 1984, Animal Farm, How Fascism Works, I was getting kind of a bleak idea on politics and what could work and what couldn't work. It just seemed to be pretty negative. So this really did reinstall the belief that, you know, we can all live together and it will be fun and it will be enjoyable. Overall, I would give this book a 6.5. The only reason it's relatively low is I just found it so hard to get through parts of the book. However, if you are very motivated to learn, you already love politics and have a good background in it, or you just have a lot of discipline, this is the right book for you. Professor Mounk is obviously an expert in what he does, and when it comes to like how much I've learned from one book and exposure to new ideas, it's probably top 5 that I've ever read. But for me, it just took so long. It's only 300 pages, and you know, there were certain days where I really had to force myself to read the next page and read the next chapter, and I had to set up like a reward system to get through it. And that's everything for today. I think this review is probably going to be a lot longer than they normally are. If you've watched it all the way, thank you so much. I hope it's been enjoyable, and stay tuned for my next review.